Well, now we're heading back into our second panel for the day and our sort of, last, as it were, discussion, which I think has been immensely provoking day and wonderful. So thank you very much indeed for all being part of it. And we're going to have three presenters in this particular stage before we go to the panel: Sarah Lethbridge, Ken Brooks and Louise Denoon. Sarah is Senior Archivist at the ANU, and she has held that position since 2006. The collection she works with, the Noel Butlin Archive, is one of Australia's largest archives of business records, and she's going to talk to us for 7 minutes. Sarah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to come up here and spread the word about our archives. It's a wonderful collection. I'll start by talking about what archives are, how it is that a university has come to have so many business archives, give an overview of the archives, the businesses whose archives we have, then talk about the way business archives are used, all in 7 minutes. 7 metric minutes of 100 seconds. Okay. I started talking about what archives are because I found there's a bit of a misunderstanding. A lot of people think it's everything. But archives are actually those records that were created or received by a business, an organisation, a person. They have an ongoing value, not just for the purpose for which they were created, but there's something else. And at archivist school, we were taught that was 5 to 10% of all the documentation. Archives are unpublished. They were created for internal use, and in fact we often wonder what the original creators of the records would make of the uses people put their records to. Would they be amused, astonished, appalled, or all of the above? And archives can be in any format: paper, photographs, film and sound, maps, plans, electronic records. It's the content that is important. Some of the companies whose records we have are listed on that screen. The reason the ANU has these records is that the late Professor Noel Butlin, who Geoffrey Bolton spoke about this morning, arranged for companies, including the Australian Agricultural Company, which has its head office here in Brisbane, to deposit their records with the ANU so he, his colleagues, postgrads, could research the Australian economy and went on collecting more and more company records, pastoral companies in particular. In the 1960s, expanded that to the other side of the business, which is the trade unions and professional associations of its workers. We're still receiving records from businesses. In fact, the Australian Securities Exchange donated all of its pre-1996 records in its custody, including stock exchange records, including Brisbane's, which is great to have. The businesses give us their records knowing that we will be making them available to anyone wanting to do research. We get things to make them accessible. It's a very important point to make, particularly to businesses who might be worried about how the information might be used and understandably want to protect themselves. So we spend a lot of time negotiating access restrictions so that sensitivities can be respected for as long as necessary. But in the end, we will be making that accessible at some time, even if it's not for another 10, 20, 50 years. We don't buy collections, as some archives do that are better funded than us. We just can't do it, but we can help businesses to take advantage of the Cultural Gifts program, which allows them to get a tax benefit based on the valuation of their records. So that's one of the things. You might say, what's in it for the business? That's one thing, but often the businesses recognise their role in Australian history, see the ongoing value, want the records to go somewhere where they'll be used, but for various reasons they can't maintain a huge physical collection of records. looking through some of the recent inquiries we've had, it seems that people use company archives to research 4 main themes: people, places, the built environment, and the natural environment, and the economy. We do joke that occasionally someone actually comes in wanting to research the records of a business to know about the business. But more often, it's that business's role in an industry, or that business is an example of a particular research team that's attracted somebody. There are commissioned histories and histories of that organisation, but they're not as common as you might think. Starting with businesses and people, many people use our business records to research an individual person for family history. A manual labourer working on a production line at CSR's sugar refinery in Pyrmont in Sydney may not have left written records, no letters, no diaries that their descendants can use to try to get an understanding of what their life was like. But their descendants might find them in the pay records of CSR, where they'll find the person's wages, salary, an idea of what their position was. And from that, if they're interested, can work out what did a storeman or a person on a production line or somebody who packed sugar all day, what was their life like from that. Also, we use some of the company records, particularly pastoral companies, for Indigenous family history. The stations often employed, or had Indigenous people working there, may not have got a salary, in fact probably didn't, but maybe mentioned in a ration book. So there'll be maybe a name that people can use to find an ancestor and help to recreate their Indigenous family history. In fact, we've counted over the last few years and found that about a third of all our inquiries involve family history research, which is pretty amazing. So that's some of the workers. A person with a higher profile in the community may be the subject of a more formal biography, which might include information about their employment or business activities. For example, a biographer might find information about the sort of businessman former Prime Minister Stanley Melbourne Bruce was from the records of the family firm, an importing firm called Patterson Lang and Bruce, and we hold their records. And the photograph on the left is from the Patterson Lang and Bruce collection and includes some of the very distinguished looking managing directors, including Stanley's father John. One of the business records that we have that we use a lot, and we'll be making a lot of fuss about over the next few years, is a record created by CSR to commemorate the role of its employees in the First World War. Many companies had honour boards listing the names of their staff who enlisted. CSR published a booklet giving profiles of its staff who enlisted, and also, in the case of somebody who died in action, have included a photograph. And the photograph on the right, and the entry with it, is about Private Charles Stanley Forster, who was born at CSR's Gundi Mill here in Queensland and worked for the company till he enlisted. And we've had at least 2 occasions when someone has used that book, found an ancestor and found a photograph for the first time that they'd ever known a photograph to exist of that person, which is great. Businesses and places. Obviously, businesses operate in a built environment, and if, as used to be the case, they built their office or factory, they designed it to say something about who they were and how they saw themselves. In fact, one of our collections in the Elder Smith Goldsborough Mort archives is a series of watercolours that they commissioned by John Goodchild to go out and paint the facade of every building, and they hung them up in their office because they were proud of the image that those buildings projected, proud enough to pay somebody who was fairly well regarded in their field to go out and paint them. The photographs, we have a lot of photographs, they're a wonderful record. They can show how buildings have changed over time, and they're useful for heritage studies, looking at an area or an individual building. These are 2 photographs of the Empire Hotel in the Sydney suburb of Annandale. They're from our Tooth and Company archives. The one on the left shows the building as it was acquired by Tooth and Company in the 1930s. They knocked it down, rebuilt it in 1937 in the style of the times. And the photo on the right was taken in 1960. Now, Tooth went out every 10 years and took photographs of the facades of all their hotels and also of the opposition. Okay. And you can use those photographs to see how things have changed over time. Okay. Environment. The photograph on the left is from the CSR collection. It shows them growing sugarcane in Fiji. On their plantations, they kept records of rainfall. And those records run over many years, and we've sent copies to the Fijian government for them to compare with now, because they had no records themselves. And the photograph on the right is of CSR's Macquarie Mills golf course, how they changed the environment to make things more comfortable for their employees. This is what we think is the oldest geological survey map in Australia, from the Australian Agricultural Company, 1827, under Newcastle Harbour, saying if you're going, and it was created to say if you're going to mine for coal, you've got to use Newcastle, because there's obviously a lot there if you can read geological survey maps. Lastly, business and the economy. Business records can be used for the economy. This is one of the Tooth and Company yellow cards, summaries of the amount of beer and other products sold to hotels from Tooth and Company. And you can tell a lot from that, because every time the licensee the license came up for renewal, licensee would plead poverty, can't afford an increase. Tooth would say, all this stuff you've been buying from us, you must be selling to someone, pay up, or yes, you can see that area is really in decline because you're not selling beer. So no, we won't increase your licence fee. And these records, actually the Tooth and Company records, were used by one of the ANU staff to do his PhD on accounting. I didn't know you could do a PhD in accounting. But that shows my ignorance. The point of that being, again, that records can be used for all sorts of purposes that they couldn't have imagined when they were creating them, and that there is something for everyone in business archives. So I guess I better end there before as my 7 minutes is bound to be up. Just a bit about our contact details, and welcome any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. I'm definitely a journalist, not an archivist. I'm sort of, it's like the people who also do a lot of documentary work and they go through archive and they've got a punctilious approach to small, detail like that. Not me. So I'm very impressed with it. Ken Brooks is going to talk to us now. He manages the Brennan and Geraghty store in Maryborough. It's a National Trust site, as I think a lot of you probably know. And Ken's been with the store since 1989. He has a particularly fetching waistcoat on today. I presume that's related to it. So let's hear from you, Ken.
Thank you. This one. Brennan and Geraghty store opened in 1871 and was closed in 1972 by Geraghy's youngest son, George. George was 88 years old when he closed the family store. And when he did, he closed it with unsold stock, including toilet paper from the 1950s, soap from the 1920s, and curry powder from the 1890s. He also left a massive collection of trading records which detail what was going on in the store through much of its 101 years of operation. The founders, Patrick Brennan and Martin Geraghty, established the grocery business in 1871 and from that time built up an empire which began to crumble by the mid-1890s. Their property and holdings included 3 orchards, 2 brickyards, a gravel works, a hotel, a cab hire company. They owned shares in both gold mining companies and sugar plantations. They also owned a factory that produced wine, port, sherry, tonic water, jam, chutney, marmalade, vinegar, tomato sauce and other products, which are all sold through their store. It's one of their labels. Quinine wine was purchased by the Sisters of Mercy Convent. A dozen bottles for medicinal purposes. The records from the 1890s show that the government analysts assayed their orange wine at 23.4% alcohol content. The end of the gold rush and the depression of the 1890s saw many business ventures fold. In 1896, Brennan and Garrity declared Brennan and Garrity was in real trouble. Its creditors called a meeting and declared the business be dissolved by insolvency rather than by bankruptcy, and that allowed Brennan and Garrity to trade out, which took until 1903. The store property was sold to one of the Garrity sons, who rented the building back to the partnership, which allowed them to continue to trade. The bank allowed for the sale of their household possessions to their wives, but they kept possession of the houses until they were paid out in 1903. That same year, Brennan went into another new business and Garrity went into retirement. He passed away the following year. The store was then run by Garrity's adult children under the name of their mother, Catherine. Now, their children were Agnes, Florence and George, with Agnes as the business head, which was a bit unusual for a woman to take over a business which had been formerly run by men. The Garritys threw nothing out. They had a family trait of hoarding, with their excuse being that they didn't own anything from their parents' generation, so they had no right to get rid of it. George passed away in 1973, and he'd left behind a treasure trove of objects which at that time were just considered as basically junk. The family were disposing of things, and when the National Trust became involved, they negotiated for the purchase of the property, which included, that's one of Brennan and Garrity's own brand jam jars. But their property included the store, the cottage, the larger residence and stables at the rear of the property. When the Trust bought the place, they bought it intact with everything, which includes in excess of 100,000 items that are all original to the store. 50,000 of those are archival records. After the death of George, his niece and nephews had decided to throw it all out. There was nothing of importance. And it was at that time that the National Trust became involved and bought the property, which opened as a museum about itself and it's in the place of Maryborough. Just to go back a little to put the importance of Maryborough into relationship with the formation of Queensland, Maryborough was first settled in 1847, when Queensland was still part of New South Wales. After separation in 1859, the development of Queensland began. Maryborough had at that time been gazetted a warehousing port along with Gladstone and Rockhampton. At those areas, the government had set up bond stores, and those bond stores were designed basically to receive government taxes for goods that were brought into the towns that had bond duties payable. One of the ledgers that survives within the Brennan and Garrity collection is a shipping register which details all the ships which brought goods in for Brennan and Garrity. It also details who the shipper was, the name of the ship, when the ship arrived, what the goods cost and what the duty and other charges were payable. It doesn't detail any goods that had no duty payable, but these are all able to be researched from incoming invoices from the various suppliers. This is some of the interior of the store. That's the office which they'd worked on for the 101 years of operation. The one thing missing is a safe, which was sold off after 1903. The Maryborough Chronicle, which was a local newspaper, was sent to London and to other overseas ports in the 1880s, 1890s. And businesses such as Brennan and Garrity that advertised in that newspaper were picked up by overseas agents. Those agents sent letters into businesses in Australian colonies to forge business relationships. And so those businesses would tell Brennan and Garrity what they could buy, what the terms and conditions were, when the goods could be sent out, and how long that would actually take them to be shipped out. Keen's mustard from London. I mentioned to somebody earlier, we had an English linguist came in some time ago who said, we got the spelling of flavour wrong on the box. We said, well, that's not a spelling error, that's how the English language spelt flavour. It's not an Americanisation of it, it's how we actually used to spell it. And somebody asked me earlier about ketchup. I think ketchup might be on here. And I said that is not an American term, it's an Australian term. They were selling mushroom ketchup from the store in 1890. These are the types of goods that are actually coming from different parts of the world. The shipping and trade networks that were set up at that time were quite complex, and because Maryborough was an immigration as well as shipping port, between the 1860s and 1900 there were over 22,000 immigrants came into Australia through the port of Maryborough. And a lot of those immigrants went into other areas. When gold was discovered, particularly in Gympie in 1867, a lot of those people had to come through Maryborough to actually get to Gympie. And those people that moved into other areas would deal with stores such as Brennan and Geraghty. So they were buying goods back from Maryborough to go into those other areas. Brennan and Geraghty at one stage sent fresh oysters from here to as far away as Charters Towers. That was quite a complex feat, even by today's standard, but they were doing it on quite a regular basis. During the restoration, we recovered in excess of about 10,000 items from underneath the store. Crockery, china, glassware that came in as damaged stock was basically thrown under the store as rubbish. This tells you where some of this china was coming from. A lot of this china we can actually match up back to incoming correspondence, incoming invoices, and as well as outgoing correspondence. So we can find out what the customers are ordering and what they're actually buying. It took us some time to fully understand the collection of objects and documents within the store and how they can potentially be used for both display and in research. The beauty of the collection is that it is fairly intact. There are some records lost through vandalism, vermin attack, and through theft during the time of the store's closure. But the records that have survived are complete enough to enable a good understanding of commercial, economic and social life surrounding the operation of a family-run business. Part of the collection includes letterbook copies of all outgoing correspondence, which match up to incoming correspondence. These documents in turn match up with shipping records, insurance on goods being ported, and with goods being imported into the store came vast quantities of advertising material. They left in excess of 500 advertising signs, most of which were designed to be used inside the store, but very few of them were ever actually used. Much of the information from the various items within the store can be brought into relevance with the trading ledgers detailing what was sold from the store, who purchased the items, how much the items were sold for, and when the accounts were paid, or when they were not paid in many circumstances. The information can in turn be linked to prosperity and economic hardship. When the restoration of the store was being carried out, we uncovered, as I said, 10,000 items, and we're still researching and documenting these. So far, most of that, I think, has been digitally recorded. That's one of the rare items that survive within the store. That's an 1890s paint chart. Brennan and Geraghty are also importing and selling paint. And the lead-based paints that they were selling, they were pre-mixed as they came into the store. And through this, we're also able to match up paints that customers were buying and what they're actually painting their houses. So we got the customers buying the different kinds of paint and the different colours of paint for different purposes. Some of those houses we can still trace, but unfortunately all the colour schemes have gone. We had a lot of people saying that the colours were quite bland. There was only a few colours available, but this is a good variety of colours that traded on for a very, very long period of time. This was one of the last things Brennan and Geraghty did. The business closed by 1903, and that same year they registered this trademark. This was the trademark and a label which was designed for the production for use on matchbox labels, but they never actually got to producing the labels. The Help Me Through the World logo at the bottom. The Geraghty's, at one stage, one of them won the Queensland casket or part of the Queensland casket. So every single lotto ticket after that, they used that as their syndicate name, Help Me Through the World. Agnes Geraghty was a voracious buyer of lottery tickets. Whenever she went away, she bought a casket ticket. She went to Perth in the 1930s, which was an incredible feat. While she was there, she bought a casket ticket, she posted it back to herself, and then she posted the results back to herself. And when she came back, she's checked it off and it didn't win. And I've double-checked and she didn't win. we still use that Help Me Through the World as our syndicate scheme for our lotto, and unfortunately we haven't won yet either. Aside of the conservation issues of the original items within the historic collection, some of the biggest challenges include digitisation, preservation of the digital information, and access to both the digital and the original resources. Being a small, basically, organisation, it's very difficult trying to get people to come to work for us. Maryborough has, I guess, there's 16 historical groups which all rely on the same kind of person, and most of those people are 70, 80, and most of those people don't like new technologies. And so there are difficult challenges for the future management of this particular collection. It needs to be managed in its original site. It's quite rare to survive in its own building. There's only one other grocery store in Australia, which is in New South Wales, which has a collection that dates from the 60s through to the 90s. And there's one in America that I've found that are intact with its own building. Generally, with historic collections like this, that weren't collections, there were products that were meant to be put on the shelves, sold, and the packaging and other goods disposed of. But this is one of those rare items that did survive. And largely it survived because the business, which was in a commercial area in the 1870s, 1880s, became in a residential area. And so the site was no longer viable for commercial purposes. And by the time George had closed his business, that one of those first images I showed, the building was in such a rundown, dilapidated state that it wasn't viable for commercial purposes. And so it was easier to demolish and build flats on that site. But because the National Trust was involved, that didn't happen. The Trust had bought the property basically for site value. And at that time, the major push from some of the bigger museums was get rid of everything after 1920. That 50-year cut-off period wasn't important. But because the National Trust didn't have the resources to do it, that collection survived. So which was a lot of accidents and a lot of untimed planning helped protect this collection. So I'm being wound up, so I think I'll finish there. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank goodness for that lack of funds. And thank you, Ken, very much indeed. And I'm sure there'll be more questions for you. Our final presentation is from Louise Denoon. She's Executive Manager of Queensland Memory at the State Library of Queensland. As Executive Manager of this project, Louise is responsible for developing the state collections, which include the John Oxley Library, the Australian Library of Art, and the General Collection. And I think Louise has been quite a driving force behind today too. So, Louise, love to hear from you.
It was here. You can't see all of this, thank goodness. So this PowerPoint's been created on Haiku, which is an app for the iPad, but we've had to translate it. So I see there's a little bit cut off there, but it's absolutely fantastic to be here and to be finally bringing together a whole lot of people to think much more broadly about Queensland's business history. We've been involved in the Business Leaders Hall of Fame for, I think, as Rolly said, 5 years. And certainly that investment, that working with the business community to tell those stories. But how do we consider it more broadly? How do we attach a business agenda to it? A research agenda to it. So the launching of the fellowship, the launching of an award to thank businesses for their, and to recognise businesses who look after their history, and this symposium. So let's hope this is the beginning. And I'd really like to thank David Allison Geoffrey Bolton for coming and being the stimulus for that discussion, and all of you who've invested in your time in being here. And I think there's such goodwill that we can build on and to work through. So what I was going to share, and then we can have the panel discussion and perhaps a few other things will come out, is some of the challenges that we at the John Oxley Library are facing, some of the issues, and I'm talking more not so much as David's agenda of interpreting and exhibiting, but actually around the collecting of business stories and history. And I think one of the things that is, it's a real challenge of the invisible stories. So there's the obvious stuff, but there is the invisible stories, whether it's of the workers, whether it's of the backroom deals. So actually talking with the National Library as well and their oral history program, and they do business leaders as well, is just that actually they're some of the most difficult collections to get, the aspect of Queensland society that is, or Australian society, that how do you get it in the record when it all happens outside of other processes. So, how do you make visible that invisible? And of course, there's the official record. So we at the, as the Legal Deposit Library, we do have all the annual reports of Queensland businesses. We have the publications. We have the business records often when businesses deposit that. But that's the official version, and it's important to have. And I loved what Sarah was saying about the unexpected uses of this material. And I'd love more people to be coming in and looking through this stuff. We diligently collect every annual report by everyone, and we know there's stories behind annual reports. Maybe Ross can come in and help reveal them to us, but that people know that they're here and can be used in different ways. But just as importantly, and I think is the behind the scenes, the flavour, the deals, the culture, the achievements, the conversations that happen. And that's why the partnership with Queensland, with the Business Leaders Hall of Fame, the oral histories and digital stories that are collected, that they're actually getting to the stories that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. And often it's that the business leaders who are being interviewed haven't necessarily thought that this was something that other people would be interested in. It's just what we do. It's not, necessarily significant. So I think, how do you get the published record as well as other versions, other accounts that take place? And so State Library, like many of you here as a memory organisations, how do we collect and interpret the complexity? How do you reveal Ross's story of Crowhorth and the business before it and the 15 name changes? Actually, when we acquired the Hall and Dodd plans, which was a great coup and a fantastic thing, when we did the administrative history back to the original, there's 15 different owners of that material till you get back to Hall and Dodds from the people who we acquired it from. So, it's not such like a history of a school or a history of a church. They're not straightforward histories often. They're, how to reveal that complexity. And I think more and more the attributes of John Oxley Library staff, it's that assessing of significance. So how do you assess, how do you interpret? How do we choose the 10 or 15% that needs to survive? How many are enough, and what is reasonable in that way? I think it's not just libraries, but libraries are very aware of it and are working in different ways. But I think as a whole community, we need to be talking about digital preservation and contemporary collecting, that the tweets, the websites, the correspondence that's happening today, this is actually going to be the dark ages of our history. This is what's going to be forgotten because it's so easy to delete and not to keep. Whereas, as David was chatting with us yesterday, paper is actually very hard to destroy. Digital files, not so easy, are easier to destroy. And how to actually keep them and keep the software that can read them. And for me, very importantly, is how do you assess significance within all of the digital deluge? Like, is it all, and there's multiple versions of things as well. So I think while it's not been a big topic today, I think being very aware that that needs a whole of society approach, including libraries, archives playing their part. But it's all, and that's why today has been so exciting, that actually what we're here collecting for is the capacity and the inspiration for people to be creating new knowledge, for new insights, new ideas, new thinking, new ways of creatively interpreting, so that we see ourselves in that space, and that the collection's value is in its use, and we want more of it used and more of it to help us greater understand Queensland and Australia and the world, really. You don't have to limit it of who might be interested in that material. And, State Library has got a very strong commitment to working collaboratively, to a shared responsibility, that we work with state archives, with national archives, with the Royal Historical Society, that we need to be working together. And importantly, the Business Leaders Hall of Fame is an opportunity to promote that working with business, which has probably been less obvious, less tangible, how you might go about it, because it's about the legacy that we're leaving and about the future. So that was all from me.
Thank you, Louise. And I'm going to ask all our guests to come to the front, please, including David, so that we can... I've got your glasses here too. So that we can see you all and be prompted by your various, they're all different in their own different ways. So I'm going to throw it open to you. What are the key questions that you're left with in this business of, really that rallying call from Louise there, to work better with business, to think through differently? I'll again kick off, but anybody wishes to make a statement? If not, ask a question about, or David's. Well, okay, I'll just happily get going, because I had a few. I am left, and I wonder, it's a little bit not for David, but what is distinctive about Queensland in all of this? Like, in terms of the original prompt, Louise, that in this, it is not designed to be purely Queensland, but are there sort of particularities in the Queensland business story that you think it's worth harnessing? And indeed, Ken, you were telling that story. What did it amount to, Brennan and Geraghty? Was it a peculiarly, you said there was only one other grocery store, but was it a peculiarly Queensland story?
I don't think it's peculiarly Queensland. I think it's typical Australian business as to how Brennan and Geraghty's operated. It wasn't unusual for that kind of store to operate in Melbourne, Sydney, or anywhere else. It was the same kind of thing right across the nation. And it would be the same in England. So it was pretty much the same as English-Australian business. So I don't think there would be a lot of difference. The only difference here is that their record survives, so we can actually track it.
Right. Because, what I got from it was just watching, was a lack of succession planning, to say the very least.
George was never married, so there's no next generation to take on the business.
Right.
But the way it worked was Brennan and Geraghty built it up and went broke. George and his sisters believed if they did the same thing as their parents' generation did, they would go broke too. So we won't bother expanding, we'll shrink the business. And that's how it continued. By the 1950s, we had modern four-square kind of stores coming. Lots of stores traded up to 4 squares or that kind of square business, but businesses like Brennan and Geraghty's didn't, because they knew they wouldn't survive. And those businesses that did change over had difficulties with the buying public, because it became a change from the grocer serving you to getting it yourself. And the older generation wanted to keep that grocer, the younger generation wanted to get it yourself. When now people would like to go back to the grocer getting the goods for them. So we've done a big cycle of how we want the business to operate.
I mean, Louise, what do you, and in terms of you, because I know that you're very interested in this idea of trying to think through, and this is to me what I got from David's, the business of drilling down and saying, what does this amount to? It's not just a collection, is it? It's how do we interpret? What does this matter to us now? How do you answer that?
Well, I think why the Business Leaders Hall of Fame has been an interesting partnership to be part of is because you have a group of business people who are absolutely passionate and committed to history. You know, absolutely. You have the induction dinner.
But is it
800
nostalgia?
People.
Pardon me for.
I don't think it is, because I think it is that they genuinely feel like, and in that way that Paul Savret was saying that, and also David, that we don't honour our business leaders in the way we would sports, or, you know, we're all comfortable with a sport hall of fame or a music hall of fame, and there are lots of those things that exist. And I think it's the business people know when you're listening to them talking about who are the people and what some of that backroom story that informs the nominations and the ideas. So I think that and also trying to address some of the ideas of what success is, because is Golden Circle being purchased by Heinz, is that, you know, because for a few people that was a good business decision. That was that was made with they made lots of money. The shareholders did well. It's just changing some of the ways you understand what success is and what keeps business up at night, and how you engage with it. I think that they're two very different cultures, of a culture of a collecting institution of history and heritage, and business culture, and how do you bring those together and have shared conversations. And I think some of today has been about creating that language and that space for discussion. I suppose, I think just on the Queensland difference, the Queensland story, is that I don't think we should limit our collections to only being good for telling a Queensland story. I think we can, that there are stories here of national significance and of global significance. We talked about, for instance, this year, it's 150 years since the first Australian South Sea Islanders came to Queensland. Well, that's inextricably tied up with the story of the sugar industry. You can't... So where am I going with that? And that then when you talk to academics at university, they're also teaching a lot of some of the courses that are most interesting for them are things like trafficking in human trafficking, and where does the Queensland story actually feed into a bigger picture as well? So it can be around the history of Maryborough, the history of of business and trade, as your story is, but it's also that we lift our expectations and ambitions in terms of how these stories might be utilised. So
can I draw in David? Because I mean, obviously, David, you've wrestled mightily with this in preparation for the American Enterprise. Could you just remember some important tipping points to get you to this, this creative, this balance between, or this collaboration between business and democracy? Now, that must have come through some big, deep consensus thinking.
A word that has been repeated over and over today, but almost uncritically, is story. This is a story, and we who care about the many aspects of this story need to learn from all the other storytellers in society how to tell this story the most effective, creative way to communicate it. We clearly can demonstrate that this aspect of our common life is an important aspect of it. But how do we tell this story? And it's not just going to be one way, it's going to be hundreds of ways. And it's up to us who care about it to really focus, not on expecting people to come to us, but like others around us, to figure out how to tell this story in ways that are compelling to our audiences. I mean, the people in sports didn't, they crafted sport in such a way that it was a compelling thing for people to watch. And do it more and more every year with different ways of communicating. I remember when watching baseball was so boring, and now they figured out a way to make it extremely interesting. How can we make this compelling and use all the tools that you were talking about, whether it's dramatizations or or video or digitization. I think the digital world offers incredible new ways to tell stories and reach people at different times of day and different locations with compelling, interesting, captivating, amazing stories. And to bring open, so much of, I think, digitalization offers such a promise for people who simply can't afford to go spend an hour or 2 hours looking at business records because they have to pay to get there and they have to find the time and so on. But if they're sitting at home and it's available to them, then they'll find it and all of a sudden it'll become amazing to them. So to me, the real challenge is, yes, let's hold on. It's a human thing, storytelling, listening to stories, being captivated by story. Mixing, if we mix fiction sometimes to lead into the story, to get you started. So I think it's in some ways the onus is on us to be more creative, more effective in telling this captivating, important story in ways that attract attention.
Did you bring in a different type of person into your team then? Did you bring in storytellers, documentary makers, blah, I don't know.
Well, one of the things that I found personally about going to the museum world, I was a traditional historian, and I really felt going in the museum world years ago when I went in it was like moving from the world of black and white to color. Seriously, all of a sudden I realized I have all kinds of tools now available to me that I didn't used to have because I had a printed page, maybe with some pictures, and not that many pictures because the publisher is going to say, no, I want to get 5. But in the museum world, we had the opportunity to make movies, to create sets, to use design, and among the most effective and creative aspects of my career has been working with designers to help craft and do things effectively. And what I always try to do when we work with design teams, which we just met with last week, is if we can determine our objective. We don't, the tendency is always to tell the designer, this is what you want. We want, want you to do this setting or something. But the right approach is always to say, this is what we're trying to achieve. So you clarify your objective. And then you work with creative people who understand the design process, and they can bring you different ways to accomplish that objective. So yes, in the museum world, it's given me the opportunity to work with all kinds of partners who are out there to work with us. Marketing people, design people, advertising people, filmmakers, other people who participate in storytelling but don't know your story. Bring them on, partner with them, draw on what they can do because they are the key to helping us tell our story in ways that people are really going to care about it.
Yeah, but I thought you would say that. That business of bringing the designers on board, I think, is really often quite challenging because they do think quite differently,
Yes.
and they just visualise, and it's marvellous to watch them. Actually, does that happen a lot in the world? I mean, Sarah, is that happening in your world at all, or not?
It's not happening enough with most of the archives, particularly those like us, mainly paper-based. There's been a traditional way of doing things that just can't work anymore. You can't expect someone to come along and look through 10 kilometres of records. We have 20. So we need to get advice and guidance from the users. Why aren't you coming to the archives? How can we get you in? How can we use new technology? And particularly for small archives like us, it would cost $90 million to digitise what we have, and that's not going to happen. But other ways of getting into what we have, and also archivists need to be more open-minded. The old way of having a reading room and people come to you isn't going to happen. We can see declining numbers coming through our doors. So we're looking at things like getting a database online a bit later than most people, but also how are we going to get people's attention in a very busy world, a very busy online world. So we should be looking and are looking to other professions to get people's attention and present information in a way that is they're open to receiving it rather than slabs of text. But it's an ongoing process that we're sort of at the beginning of because we've got a legacy professionally and as an organisation. So any advice we can get on how to encourage people to come and use us, because we know what we've got is wonderful, would be appreciated.
Is it daunting? Must be pretty daunting to face.
It's horrifying because we know that we have 20 kilometres of paper, some AV, some digital records. We know roughly what's in there, but how can we, and if we don't get it out, people will bypass us, people will go somewhere else, and then why are we there? It's very daunting, and it's a huge professional challenge that we've got to actually come to terms with and get users, and be willing to listen to people in other industries who are better at getting people's attention and giving people things the way they want them, rather than being purists and saying, no, the record must be protected. The record only is useful for what it can give to other people. So yeah, daunting is a good word.
Is part of your problem that it doesn't, it's a sort of an eclectic collection. It's not a national collection, it's not a state collection, it's
sort
really
of
like Topsy.
yes, it did. We do call ourselves a national collection because we take nationally significant companies, only some companies. We are sort of the if other archives get offered business collections, sometimes they will refer to us because they know that we specialise in it and they don't. There are plenty of archives to go around. There's no need to be competitive. But we do try to be a nationally focused archive. We don't have much from Western Australia or Tasmania, but we have a fair bit from the eastern states. But it is eclectic. We don't go out, we don't have we have a collecting policy, but we don't have a list of targets of companies that we would like to get records from. There are 6 of us. We can't resource that. So we don't have a coherent, we want your records, your records, your records. We get approached, we get approached by an organisation, usually because someone in a position of authority recognises the importance of their business and what it's done and its long history, and says, we've got a story to tell, we're part of the nation's history, we want you to take this on and make it accessible. We can't, so please take it and get it out to users. So it's not as coherent as we'd like to be, but it's the best that we can do. And actually, the more collections you have from more collections of archives that you have from high-profile companies that are well known, like Bursphilp, CSR, the more that gets the attention of people who either see themselves as the peers or competitors, or you got their records, will you take ours? But yeah, many archives are not as coherent as they would like to be, because no one is compelled to give us their records. They don't have to. There's no legislation. It's just they think it's a good idea, and we do as well, and we know there's an audience. Yeah.
Sorry.
This follows on from Ross's question, probably affects Louise and Sarah in the Australian context, but this whole issue of collection policy, and quite frequently where a series of records goes often ends up as sheer happenstance. Now just say, Louise, somebody got in touch tomorrow and said, oh goodness, my Aunt Sarah died and I've got 5 boxes of records of the company she ran with her husband in Bendigo, Victoria. Can they go to the State Library? What do you do in those circumstances? And if you had someone coming to you saying, I've found all these boxes under Aunt Sarah's bed, do you say, well, they should go to Victoria because it's just one little business? What happens in that sort of situation? Do you trade with similar repositories?
I think particularly in a library world, we have an alliance with, work with the national and state libraries very productively. And I think that it's, clearer and clearer that, collections should come to the state that they're most relevant to. And we have a collaborative rather than what was the exhibition design? A cooperative rather than a competitive context in that. But sometimes it's difficult to ascertain whether it might be a very important Queenslander and therefore we would take it. I think once you sort of take out your institutional ego, you also, if they're in public collections and they're publicly accessible and they're being looked after, then, you know, whether they're in the Toowong Historical Society or here or at Noel Butlin, it's sort of working that stuff out. And we all have less and less resources, or the same resources to do more and more. It is also, I think, how do we become about assessing the significance and more proactively going after material that we know are gaps in the collection, rather than only relying on people who know about us and then we, you know, create the same material. But I think one of the other areas that is making and transforming, and I've said this in a couple of forums and I want to say it again here too, because I just think that digitisation, you look at the digitisation of newspapers, of government records, of material, really it's transforming research. And I don't think that research that the outcomes is as interesting as it could be. What we're doing is what we've always done, faster and faster. So rather than spending 9 months researching something, you can do it in 9 minutes. But have we, you know, is the transformation of what we can know actually coming about? And I really think that unless we sort of use all of our curiosity, all of our intelligence to think about, well, what is it that we could now know, now that there is so much more data available and it's searchable and movable and, you know, comparative. And so Gavin's got something, you know, got a comment. So I think I don't think we've caught up yet with what is on offer.
We were offered the records of Fletcher Jones by the founder's son, and he came and talked to us, and we said, well, why don't you go and talk to the University of Melbourne Archives? They do what we do, but their focus is Victoria, business and labour of Victoria. Go and talk to them, because keeping records records need context, and the place is a very important part of the context. So go and talk to the University of Melbourne. If for some reason negotiations fall through, come talk to us, but the records went to Melbourne. We, as I said, we can't pay for collections, and some organisations would like some money. Other archives, National Library is in a position to buy some collections. So if that's a focus, an important thing for you, go and talk to them if you meet their collecting policy. But there's no point in arguing or trying to get everything. As you say, the fact that the records are safe, accessible, is more important than who has them.
Is Gavin, is it?
Hi, I'm Gavin from State Library. I was just picking up on Louise's point about research just basically being sped up by digitisation, but not being inherently different from what, say, Ross was been doing his whole career. But in terms of... But I think the digital humanities, which is it's a new area of research, is one particular place that new ways, by querying material in a different way, you can come to outcomes unexpectedly and in a different manner to traditional academic research. And one of those that we're working on at the State Library at the moment is to do with the post-war, post-45 architecture in Queensland, where we've done a whole series of interviews with oral histories with Queensland architects and people involved in the architectural industry. And using things like full text analysis of those oral histories, you can start plotting the instance of a particular word. So if you start seeing a word occur more frequently within an oral history, and you can start through semantic web analysis and technical things like through computer technology and algorithms, you can start forming conceptual maps between architectural practices and start, if you apply a positive or negative connotation to words, you can start, because all architects bitch with each other, you can start applying which architects like which architects and which architects don't like which architects. So you can come to new resolutions through this new technology, and I think that's an exciting future and something which I could see things heading. And it's complementary to traditional research. It's not at the expense of it.
Very interesting.
Can I jump in on this?
Yep.
Just I really think that there are significantly new ways of doing research. Let me just mention three that digital technology helps us with. One is new kinds of sources. I mean, traditionally, people wrote from the sources that they got access to, and digital technology is providing all kinds of additional sources that historians just never looked at. You couldn't afford to find them, they weren't organized, they weren't indexed, so you can get foreign language sources and have the computer translate them for you in ways that before you had to pay a translator. So that's one, is just all kinds of different sources that you never would have looked at are available. Number two is visual literacy. We have tools to not only get access to visual materials, but to take them apart, to zoom in on them, to look at them, and there's so much more information that you can see visually and present visually to your audiences. So I know that all the people that come to work at the Smithsonian, if they don't know how to use Photoshop and other visual tools, we teach them. And it's amazing to me that in universities, that's not one of the things that's absolutely required learning, is how to use visual tools. And the third thing is data analysis, which is what you were talking about, that the new tools, even a little spreadsheet analysis that you can do, but massive data crunching, whether it's counting words or pulling figures out and working on them to get that data and parse it and look at it different ways. And those are real increases in knowledge, and I'm sure there are many more, but those are three that we're very sensitive to how we do our work that truly are new in the last few years.
I was just speaking before lunch. I'll come. Who were the people I was speaking to just at afternoon tea who were doing that? No, not Della. Who was the other two people I was speaking with who were doing that very interesting work about posing new questions? Oh, come on, put your hand up. I just can't find. I can't see you. Don't tell me you both left. It was very interesting.
Posing new questions.
Well, it was really like, in terms of trying to get new questions out of existing material by looking at really different forms of curiosity. You're not here.
Oh yeah, that was the Centre for Government.
Was it?
UQ people, was it? Yeah.
Oh, well, never mind.
Marion Stell.
It was very interesting.
Yeah.
I can't remember there were so many things going through my head, but it struck me that it was just posing a different way of you might pose the question of exploitation, or you might pose the question of leadership, but in ways of trying to digest the material. It was quite different. Now, who put their hand up? Yes, actually just the lady. You did, yes, I think first.
I'm one of the reference librarians who works here at the State Library, and I had a question for Sarah and one for Ken. Sarah, I was very interested to hear you mention these ration books and Indigenous names in them. And I'm wondering whether you're compiling some kind of index to these names that would be accessible via your website.
Yeah. We're not actually doing that. One of the things that we do is to present, as part of the IATSIS link-up training every year, Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies does courses for a few times a year for people, caseworkers, going out talking to Indigenous people and helping them trace their ancestry. We have started doing, we've got one index to one. Victoria River Downs Station had a really great record. It had the person's Indigenous name, European name, name of husband or wife, name of children. Very unusual to find that level of information. Often it's just a name like Sam, and this is what he got. So because there's so little information, we tend to say, we have this book from this station of this time. If you think you want to look at it, let us know. But for that Victoria River Downs station, we did index that because it was so rich. We'd never seen anything like that from any other station.
It's absolute gold for Indigenous family history research.
It is, and we send that to IATSIS and they send it around, and people are coming and using it. So wherever possible, we do share as much information as we can to make it useful.
One other question to Ken. If I was interested in looking at some of those images you talked about, the advertising material, if I wanted to get a list of, say, all of the tea adverts from that shop, can I go to a website and look in a catalogue under
Not
tea?
at this stage. We're still indexing. As I mentioned, my volunteers are not young, We still index onto the very old-fashioned index card systems, and that works well for us. Part of the beauty and the problem with the store is if we had a computer on the counter, it just destroys that immediate visual impact, and so it's hidden away. And the volunteers, because we're so low on volunteers, can't be hidden away. So we index at the front, and that ultimately will be accessible, which with both customers' names, supplier names, companies that are represented, such as the variety of tea, where the tea was coming from, who was supplying it, all that's going on a card index system, which will eventually be on a central index, accessible over the internet. But that's not going to happen this week.
And will that be via the National Trust website?
National Trust nationally have developed a new website. We each had separate websites for each state, and the National Trust had previously websites for each property, which was unmanageable in the overall scheme. So it's been redevised as a national trust website. Each of the properties will be linked onto that one, or each of the states and their properties onto that one website. It's my aim to get the Brennan and Gertie records linked to that website as well. How far they're ahead on that, I don't know. But any indexing we do is quite easily transferable onto any database.
Now there's just, yes, there you are.
Thank you. My question's for David. Firstly, a couple of us were just talking at afternoon tea. Where do they get the money for that? I mean, because it's an enormous undertaking. Are you able to divulge your source?
Sure. The Smithsonian is an interesting organisation. It's a public-private partnership. It has been since it was founded in the 19th century, and actually started because the illegitimate son of a British nobleman willed his money to the United States if he died without issue, which happened. And the United States took the money, didn't know what to do with it, invested in railroad bonds, which went south and had to reimburse and so on. But we've always been a public-private partnership. So we are today, and in the museums, about 70% of our budget is federally funding, which is mostly building and staff. But all the rest is privately raised. So for major exhibitions, all the money except for the staffing has to be privately raised. So we do a lot of fundraising. The lead sponsor for this new exhibit, American Enterprise, is the Mars Corporation, but we have about half a dozen other sponsors, some foundations, some private companies, some family-owned businesses. The working budget, it's a 20-year show, it's about $20 million. That covers the original cost, the design, but also an endowed curator in that, and maintenance for the 20 years, which will also include upgrades. So the base cost is about half of that, which is mostly paying for design and production. So that's a brief summary. But that pattern is about the same for the 3 floors of our renovation. The budget for all 3 floors is $150 million, $50 million a floor, which again includes endowed curatorial positions, because our staffing, like everybody else, has just declined, and we're trying to rebuild that on the private side. And we'll fund the long-term development. So it's a major fundraising initiative at the Smithsonian, which is trying to do more and more on the private side, realizing the public side is at best going to remain low.
And you took us through the various parts of the exhibition. Where's the room for dissident voices in that exhibition? Well,
We try in all different areas to try to give a complex of American business. So on our biography wall, for example, we have perspectives of many different people, some failures, some opponents. We have thinkers who are critics. Labor, even though I didn't highlight that, labor is included as well as management. In fact, we have one interesting thing where we're comparing in the corporate section, labor and management. We create sort of an archetypal labor person out of a variety of different objects of what workers use, and a management person out of a variety of different objects that managers use, just to make that juxtaposition very clear. So we do quite a few juxtapositions of distant voices and different perspectives. And that includes, as we were talking this morning, things that are gender difference, ethnicity, and just outright opposition, strikes and things like that.
Interesting. Del. Sorry? Oh, okay.
Olivia.
I'd given there the nod, that's all. I just tried to... sorry.
Okay, so a lot of what we talked about seems to be going back to communicating history and making it accessible, and I just Ken was saying, you know, you've got a very old age group that's trying to work on it, and I thought I'd tell you about a project. We've got a Your Community Heritage project that Humans just got a grant, and we're working with a local historical society, and there was the question, most of the committee and the volunteers are 70 plus, don't have a great deal, and they're trying to create interest in what they've got, an amazing archive. But the local generations, much younger, are not coming for the 4 hours a week that they're open, and they don't know what's in there. So what we've suggested is an intergenerational community project where we do digitise what's significant, which is really a hard thing to guess, but we're working on those digital stories and creating a map that they'll be able to look at their iPads and their iPhones as they're walking around and pop up those digital stories. And from that, you gain the interest, not only because within the walls we've started to teach the local people how to use digital storytelling skills so they become part of the community, the membership gets younger, but they're also starting to take on those histories that are being recorded, and they're put somewhere that everybody can find them in their own lounge rooms. And that is causing a flood of people to actually come back to the physical museum because they're reminded that it exists again.
Do you use YouTube? Do you use grabs for YouTube?
It'll be up on all sorts of social media. We'll have a YouTube channel. We just started the project. We've only just got the funding. It'll be on we'll have Vimeo embeds into the actual Historical Society's website, but we have a platform which becomes a page on their website, which is a map, like a Google map, and it has a little flag, and you go to that flag and up pops the story. So if you're geolocated by your iPad or your mobile device, you can be standing on the street corner, you can see where you are, you pop on that and you can see that that building was owned or had a special story, or was, you know, might be the local school that's had its 150-year anniversary. They've got several stories to tell and they can all come up. We did something called rockhamptonstories.com.au. You can go and have a look. That was a community project where the community did storytelling and they started to tell a whole lot of their history. It was meant to be a flood recovery project, but a lot of people wanted to tell their history. So that was the first generation of our platform, but it's something that you can actually expand out to be Queensland-wide, Australia-wide, just by using what technology already exists.
And behind our patient person. Thank you.
I'm just Olivia from the State Library, and I just wanted to ask David a question about the, you know, beyond the exhibition, the longevity of the project and the work that you're doing. What other things are the Smithsonian institution sort of focusing on? Is it about collecting business history? Is it about encouraging businesses to sort of record their own history and keep archives? Is it about, you know, growing that interest out there? Is it about changing the exhibition over the, you know, the following years once it's up? I'm just curious about those other activities.
Yeah, right, some of all those things, we are not really, it's not our mission to advocate this throughout society. It is our mission to build relations between the Smithsonian and other museums throughout the country. We have a Smithsonian's affiliations program, so as we find other museums throughout the nation, we want to build partnerships with them, jointly develop things with them, loan objects to them. So we do have that advocacy role. We, like you, are struggling to figure out the best way to communicate and fulfill our mission in a new and changing world. So we're extremely interested in trying all the new tools and figuring out the ones that work for us. I have a strong passion for making the collections that we've amassed over a century available. I mean, we have, we say we have about 3 million objects in our museum. That's about 2 million physical objects and about 1 million documents. And they are absolutely no use to anybody sitting in our warehouse. But I am sure, I mean, you say that's why, oh my gosh, you should get rid of someone. In fact, the United States of America, we're the only National History Museum. So if you look at the history of our nation over the time period that we're covering, it's not too big, it's way too small. The number of things that we can think about that we should have as part of the nation's material culture collection should go astronomically, but not if we can't do something sensible with it. When we put things out, when we digitize them and get them out so people can have access to them, there is a huge audience for absolutely everything we have. And in fact, all the archives that we've talked about, there is a major audience somewhere in the world for that material, if they can get it easily. So we've just got to figure out the way to do that in a cost-effective way that we can that we can handle. So that in the twilight of my career, that's a problem that I really want to work on. We've made a lot of progress in solving some internal problems to make that more efficient and so on. I was talking to, I think, Louise earlier. I truly believe that one of the things we should look at is a digital volunteer corps, particularly the baby boom generation in the United States that's retiring. These are a lot of smart people. Many of them will have means, they will have time on their hands, and we should create an elite corps, so it's a competitive process, of people who can help us if we can just image this material and get it out to people to do the research, to do the interpretation, to do review of each other and get it back to us. And we've talked about doing that. We're doing a little bit of that with the National Postal Museum, but one of my goals is to try to make that the solution, the cost-effective solution of how to get 2 million objects digitized and available.
And I think in Australian context, the absolute surprise of the digitisation of Australian newspapers through Trove, and there are literally thousands of volunteers who are transcribing that newspaper. That took everyone by surprise, that there was this appetite, this audience of people who would do that. And so if they're prepared to do that, what are other, how else can you do that? And just going back to your comments about, I think that, the State Library talks about co-create. I think everyone wants to be a creator of history, not a consumer anymore. So they actually want to either do their family history or make their DVD or make their story. And it's how do you use that as, that there are all of these sources that you can use to create your own history. What it does do then is which of those histories that people are doing should we be keeping for the long term and which shouldn't we be? Because unless we make decisions now, they won't be there to keep.
One other new idea on this that somebody talked on it here is that there's a tremendous hunger for genealogy in the United States. The National Archives is embarrassed by the fact that they have 4 times the number of genealogists that are researching in the National Archives than people that are interested in the history of the government. And so ship decks logs and registrations for artillery units and so on are hugely popular. And we began talking to Ancestry.com about maybe working with the Smithsonian because they're finding that what people who are interested in genealogy are doing is it's no longer good enough to find the will and find that your great-grandfather did such and such. He lived in Queensland, and all of a sudden they say, well, what was it like to live in Queensland? What was it like to shop in Queensland? So they don't want just a family genealogy, they want a family history that's got context and story about it. And if we can find ways to tie the material in a store, the material in an archives, to that interest, so all of a sudden they can round out their story, maybe not exactly what their family is doing, but their family living in Queensland or in the United States in a certain period of time, and you can help them see what that life was like. And all of a sudden your records become meaningful to them from a genealogical perspective and a family history perspective, not simply national history. I think that, again, is a budding market that we can tap into because the interest is there if we can just translate how they use our material to satisfy that interest. And then once you do that, then you can get support from them to actually make it all happen.
But as you know, one of the things I was thinking about is Who Do You Think You Are, which is a terrific program that's on SBS here, and the Brits started, I think, and we sort of have our little series in the midst of it. Now, that's a fascinating one to watch, to sort of see what is interesting and what isn't, and what travels and what doesn't, and how what is really small and tiny and frankly of no interest beyond you and your uncle, and what is. I was actually even going to suggest, have you thought of proposing, even if it was to sort of Queensland commercial networks, getting the funding, and you just might, for a sort of a short series of business history of Queensland where you actually devised a means, after a lot of thinking, of clear sort of marker buoys in the history, and you told that cleverly based on that template that they do it on the personal level. I think that could be a wonderful idea, and you could model that here, and then it could be offered, because to me that's the way. Yes. I still think that a lot of what we've been talking about, I can't see how it travels beyond somebody intimately interested in the issue, and it seems to me you're asking for more than that. So you've got to think outside the box into some form of...
and I think it is that, as you say, that much, that level of ambition, but it's also what is it that we you know, what is it that we want to say? You know, Geoffrey Bolton, people have said that, you know, what's the next story that we want to tell as well? So I think it needs to be that partnership between collecting organisations, historians, storytellers, journalists, you know, to come together to, and that's, I think, you know, we meet tomorrow with a masterclass with David and an opportunity to really brainstorm and to think through and to workshop in a hypothetical kind of way what would be the themes, ideas, the objects, what are some of those unexpected things that can come out of that.
On the story of an accountancy firm.
Or maybe not.
but it's got to be more. That's what I was.
Yeah.
It's got to be who survives and who doesn't. What are the patterns? What's the role of leadership? Like, you've got to get into bigger issues, don't you? Not
I think, and it's a shame, Peter Little. I mean, just when we've met with, you know, because normally I would meet with with historians or academics in that setting, but when you're talking with the business faculty and the ways in which that they're teaching, you know, because Queensland history is not taught anywhere at a university anymore, but the people who are interested in it are Queensland architecture. That is taught fantastically, and that's where this project that Gavin is talking about has come from. I think if you also come, the business faculty, but what those students and people are interested in is in themes around business of leadership or resilience is very important, values, the importance of values and how they carry across, and of course entrepreneurialism, which you know is such a buzzword and people are interested in that. How do you actually then shape the stories around those themes that businesses are interested in? So I think it is, how do you reorientate yourself
But
with
is it
different
around
lenses?
what business is interested in, or is it about
It's what they're
community's
teaching
interested
business.
in?
Well, it's what they're teaching business students. So is that, that's a thing to test. Does the community care less about resilience or values in a business context and how that has been shaped over time?
Yes, please.
So just,
yes.
I mean, just following on from what Louise says, that's what I find so inspiring about the Smithsonian Institution exhibition, that it's actually it's making things relevant to the average person that comes
absolutely.
into the museum.
It's judgment. I mean, big judgments. There's a lot of prioritising, angle getting. They've got angles. That's what I hear.
Yeah.
Which is the result of a lot of hard work, and someone's won the argument. I don't know whether it's you.
And another thing that we talked about back and forth is family stories. And one of the things that we talk a lot about in our exhibitions is how do you get that intergenerational conversation going? I expect your store is a perfect place for that. Seriously, I mean, you know, kids come in and their parents, nostalgia leads to conversation. Oh, I remember this, your grandmother, and you know, then the young person gets engaged through their family structure. I remember very vividly when I first came to the Smithsonian, it was during my first exhibit, which was Mentioned Information Age, and talking to our educator. And she said to me, what is it that makes a successful exhibition? Why do people come? I said, well, they want to learn something. She said, wrong. They want to come to have a successful family outing. If you give a family a successful family outing, then maybe you can teach them something. If they're having a bad time as a family, you're not going to teach them anything. And I really have never forgotten that. You know, if you can, so they have to know where the bathroom is. There's got to be food there. You know, when they come in, there's got to be something that Junior does while Dad's doing this, and you have to generate some conversation and some oh wow moments intergenerationally. And then there's memory, and then there's an experience that they remember, and then there's learning. So, you know, and that's not the same in other environments, not the same in archives, but understanding where your audience is and reaching out to them and touching them and finding them and grabbing them. And a lot of that, I think there's a hunger for family experiences, what brings family together. And history is one of the things that brings family together if we can tell it effectively and reach them.
Well, look, I think that's, even though we're a teeny bit early...
Can I ask one final question, Ken? How was the 1883 curry? Was it palatable?
It's still fine. We've got about 30 bottles of it in stock. It's one of the items that they were stocking in bulk because, of course, we didn't have refrigeration for meat. And so you ate meat that was several days old, or you ate meat that was heavily salted you needed to draw that salt out or that old flavour of the meat out, and then you flavoured it up with mustard or curry. Mustard, they'd said Mr. Keane got his fortune from the mustard that people left on the side of their plate, not the mustard that they ate. But curry was the same. You had to learn how to use the curry, and when they marketed this particular curry, they put a recipe on how to make a chicken curry on the front of the bottle. And it's something that we use today. We haven't made it, I haven't opened it, or I haven't one of them, but it's probably the only product in the store that you could still actually use. And there's nothing wrong with it.
Well, look, I do think we've had a treat today. I really do. I said I wasn't sure exactly where we go, and frankly, it has gone into some very interesting areas, nooks and crannies, that I didn't quite expect. I think it's still, though, I think you've prompted something that's got a long way to go. I really think that what we're hearing from David is the result, I can hear it, of years of winner, and somebody winning and saying, no, we're not going there, we're going there. It's just the essence of that, coming to grips with, that terrible phrase in filmmaking, burning your babies. I'm sorry, it's a terrible phrase, but it's getting rid of that which you just is not absolutely central to your task, which is still very good, but it's just not part of that core thing. Gee, it's tough, but look, it's been really provocative. So thank you. Would you please thank our particular guests, Louise, Ken, and Sarah, and David Allison, and congratulations to all concerned. Thank you.